Yeah. Write Badiou and see if he'll stick to his answer to the question. To this question. I'd love to see how he himself would answer it, because I don't know that there are enough resources in what he's written, and so far I think I've read everything he's got in English, but I don't think there are enough resources to give a definitive answer on this name. But it seems to me that yeah, he's got to be open to that possibility. He's got to be open to it. But I think to some extent we could say it's nothing more than a gesture of humility on his part, simply to say. Right now, it's a period of experimentation and thought and action in that sense, while we wait to see what emerges. But this may be loosely connected, maybe even more profoundly connected with Zizek's constant criticism of Badiou, which is that he doesn't have an economic theory. Zizek's consistent criticism is you've got a political theory, you're stuck in state and revolution. You need to read what is to be done, right? And he's got some even more pointed critiques of the logics of worlds. But this may be connected to the same sort of thing that Zizek is pointing out, that it sounds like you're trying to get away from the actual practical issues to some extent. That may or may not be. Chris?
Yeah, my question, so this notion of having a sequence start up, I was wondering if Badiou mentions anywhere the Polymaths or the Naxalites. Has he written on this at all? Because I know Zizek touches on it slightly.
I'm not aware of any.
Okay, I was just wondering if maybe Greg would like to chime in. But
if he does,
whether he thinks this is the opening of a new sequence.
If he does anywhere, it would have to be in the end of his book Polemics, but I don't recall him talking about it.
Okay.
That's his most historical work. Again, this book in July will probably be really revealing. His book, The Meaning of Sarkozy, was meant to be an intervention just after Sarkozy's election in France. And I think Badiou stumbled on this idea of the communist hypothesis, patted himself on the back, and said, I think I've finally figured out what I've been trying to do for the last 10 years. And so I think, it's telling that his next book is called The Communist Hypothesis. It's clearly he's going to try to work through this in more rigor and detail, whereas the other one was a polemical intervention. It's not a work of theory by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm hoping that he'll deal with more history in this kind of book. This is why I say pre-order on Amazon.
So do you think though, I mean, he might view this, right, me and Greg have a conversation all the time that if the Naxalites are successful in India, that changes the whole entire spectrum of the world.
Yeah.
And this could be a new sequence, is my rudimentary understanding of what
it could well be, and I think if it turns out, if it goes in that direction, I think Badiou will be the first to say, here we are. I see Badiou being strategic as well in his approach to all of this, in that I think that part of what he's doing is saying, look, we needed Hegel before what happened in 1848, and we needed, well, as we've said, the French Revolution, and we needed the theory of Lenin before the actual Bolshevik Revolution and so forth. So I think there's some extent to which he's saying, I'm going to do the philosophical work and lay this groundwork. The fact that Badiou's work is receiving such wide attention in non-revolutionary circles, I think has done more for the wider viability, public viability of revolutionary and emancipatory politics than almost anything else has in the past few decades. So to some extent, I think he's being extremely strategic with this. Dave.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, perhaps he's leaving it up to us to actually construct what the future will be, to actually figure it out. Like, he doesn't have an idea, he just figures that it will come out of what happens in the future.
I think that's right to some extent, although I think by us he means him as included, right?
Oh yeah.
He's leaving that future. There's a line in The Meaning of Sarkozy where he says, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend to know what's going to come. But I think he's got a few ideas. He's probably just being a good modest. He wrote a few interventions just after the economic crisis in the French newspaper Le Monde, where he was a bit more vocal on what he thought might be happening. But I've not seen those find out what any books in. Chris?
I would just ask this maybe as I'll just ask it. You mentioned that, right, capitalism destroys all truths. Could you give examples of this?
I mean, those 4 points that he mentions are perfect examples, right? So science is replaced with technology. Science is reduced to technology. In other words, it's enslaved to capital. So that science can only go so far as the funding, right? art, the same problem. Art gets caught up in economy and all this kind of thing. So that for him, and it means that things are no longer free to pursue the truths, almost entirely because the definition of those truth procedures gets reduced to its economic equivalent.
So things like Valentine's Day for love, and then obviously our politicians are bought off.
Yeah, I mean, one example he cites, I don't remember where he talks about it, I swear it's in Polemics. I was trying to find it the other day. But one example he gives, for example, is the struggle to legalize homosexual marriage, right? It's entirely an economic affair. And he says, if there's love going on in a homosexual relationship, why does it need to be registered with the state, reduced to an economic level, and all this sort of thing? It actually compromises the truth procedure of love. The task is to reinvent love and to stand by it and say love happens, love is, rather than reducing that to its economic equivalent. So, perfect example. Yeah.
So just building off of this, would you then say that for Badiou, the method, or perhaps it would even be ontology by which capitalism disintegrates truths, is by regulating the situation, by making the situation equivalent, or to make the situation regular rather than having an inconsistency, to making it consistent rather than inconsistent.
Rendering it consistent, absolutely. Yeah, totalizing. Which is why Badiou, this is one of the reasons that Badiou's atheism is so important to understanding his work. Because for him, it's a religious move. That capitalism is a religious move. It's a way of plugging up with some kind of transcendence, something that plugs up the system so that it can remain consistent. Like I said earlier, right, that may or may not fit into certain religious systems or whatever. But for him, it's a fundamentally theistic move, and I think it's a really striking point. Jake?
Yeah, in his manifesto for philosophy, he speaks of sutures. Would you say that this is just kind of a consequence of everything being sutured to the political?
This is. What do you mean by this?
Well, I mean, like this sort of totalizing of truth via capitalism.
It is a consequence of the suturing of philosophy to politics?
Right. I mean, because like when you think about it, like all the philosophical issues are things like through identity politics and things like this, and you know, women's liberation is done through political means and economic means. I mean, obviously, capitalism, politics, economics.
I think he's more approving of sutures. I didn't talk about sutures in the paper here. I think he's more approving of sutures than he is of economy. I don't think that sutures for him are a question of economy. In that suture, for everyone else, Badiou talks about these four truth procedures, and philosophy is the thinking of their compulsibility. When philosophy gets attached to one of those truth procedures only, he calls that a suture. So that, for example, in Heideggerian philosophy over the past century, philosophy ends up being sutured to art. Philosophy is the task of thinking about art, says being is a question of art and all this kind of thing. But I think he doesn't see that as a consequence of economy at all. What's going on there is simply a missing of what's happening in philosophy. So it's a dereliction, if you will, of philosophy, but not of truths. It doesn't dismiss truths as such. In fact, it may take art to be the only truth procedure, but it still regards it as a truth procedure. Whereas economy would actually reduce it from truths to this flattened.
I see. So it's really just the weakness of philosophy overall.
Yeah. Sutures are a question of philosophy's weakness, whereas what's going on in these others is a weakness of our giving into capitalism, giving into economy.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, so I've been wondering this. Most people, they deal in the world of opinions. That's what they care about.
Yes.
And how would that relate? You know, it seems like only a few people deal in the world of truths. They come up with these ideas, and then they become propagated as opinions. In my opinion.
Yeah.
In that the people, the masses, don't actually understand the truths that were being taught at first.
Yeah, the whole question is massively complicated by what Badiou is doing with truths, right? If I'm hearing you right, it sounds like you're still assuming something like an epistemological model here, where, so for example, in Plato's famous allegory of the cave and his divided line from the Republic, you've got the difference between mere opinion or belief, and on the other hand, you've got knowledge, where you're dealing with truths, the forms, and this kind of thing. So knowledge, epistemology, is tied directly to truths. But for Badiou, he's trying to break that epistemological model by saying that an invariant truth is actually something that has to be constructed. There's no self-evidence whatsoever involved here. So that this opinion becomes a really murky concept here. In other words, you can't say that's mere opinion because the truth is self-evident, right? The self-evidence is dropped out of the equation. So the difference between an opinion and a truth is much more minimal in Badiou's model than it was under the epistemological model, where you could just say, that's mere opinion, whereas this is a question of knowledge. Here, it's not opinion versus truth. It's truths. Truths are a question of consistent fidelity to what has been glimpsed in an event, whereas the opposite of truths would simply be betrayal, abandoning a truth procedure, giving up.